Hi there, thanks for joining me again. This is part 4 of my Origins of Ancient Rome series. I'm Colin Elliott. I am a Roman historian at Indiana University. I'm the host of the Pax Romana podcast, which you can find anywhere podcasts are available. I'm also the author of a book called Pax Romana, The Plague That Shook the Roman World. You can pick that up anywhere books are sold. All right, let me just say something briefly about the video series, just in case you are getting to this for the first time. Just want to let you know you're coming to it out of order. That's okay. Each of these videos is independent of each other, but they are part of a 6-part series. Part 1 looked at Italy from about 4000 BC to roughly 1000 BC. We talked about technology, landscape, geography, how these sorts of things laid the groundwork for Rome to be a successful city. We then looked at the cities of Italy, the rise of city-states. We talked about what a city-state was, especially in an Italian context. We then looked at part 3, which was the last video I just finished recording, the founding of ancient Rome. We talked about the legend of Romulus and Remus, and now we are going to get into part 4. Part 4 looks at Rome's first kings. We'll continue the story of Romulus and then also talk about a few of the other kings that followed after Romulus. Then I might say a little bit also about kind of why those myths exist. The kings that we'll talk about today are probably not historical, or at least much of what is memorialized about them is not historical. Maybe there's some grain of truth to each of these individuals, but we'll talk about why the stories are the way that they are as we go through them. We'll hit a natural break in those first few kings because Rome will become ruled by Etruscan kings. I want to use part 5 of this series to talk a little bit about this culture. It's very influential on the city of Rome in its early centuries, and then the Etruscan culture just kind of goes away. So it's a little bit of a mystery. We'll talk about that in part 5. Part 6 looks at the culmination of the pre-Republican history of Rome. We'll talk about how the last Roman king managed to get himself in a bit of trouble, mostly through some actions of his son, and what happens when the nobles in the city of Rome decide to overthrow the monarchy. That'll end this 6-part series. If you do like these videos, I hope that you will indicate that by liking the video, leave a comment, let me know what you thought, and of course you can subscribe to the channel. That will tell me that you're interested in seeing more videos made like this, and I will go ahead and do that if that sounds like it's something of interest to people. All right, let's get to part 4, Rome's first kings. All right, when I last left you, we talked about the founding of Rome with Romulus. Rome was founded, at least in the mythical story, in 753 BC. Romulus draws his boundary line around the Palatine Hill, and his brother Remus chooses the Capitoline Hill. Those two brothers have a bit of a squabble. Part of it is over some birds, and as kind of a sign from the gods. There's also maybe some mockery that occurs between the two brothers. The stories are slightly different depending on which one you read. But either way, there is some fratricide in the founding of Rome, and Romulus kills his brother Remus, and that begins the first king in Rome. Romulus is the first king. Now, Romulus has some problems. So he has a city, but he does not yet have a lot of men in the city. And so he opens up the city to a bunch of just refugees from other cities. And these, of course, are not going to be the best men in the other cities. They're going to be the worst men, the criminals, the vagrants, the transient people, the poor, people that are in debt and running away. They are otherwise just kind of the castaways from the other cities there in the region, in Latium and in central Italy. So that's how the mythical story goes. Now, you open up your story to a bunch of men, great. What are you going to do now? Well, you need women. And what happens is called the rape of the Sabines, which the Romans are neighbors with numerous other peoples, and there are rivalries between them. There are also some festivals and religious ceremonies and market days that are shared among the various peoples in the region. So there's kind of a frenemies thing going on between Rome and the other cities in the area. So there is a festival, and the Romans, while that festival is going on, the Sabine men are occupied with it. The Roman men come in, and they, just like this coin right here shows, they kidnap the Sabine women. So this is a coin that's minted hundreds of years after these mythological events occur, but the memory is still very fresh. Here are some Roman men carrying off some women, almost caveman-like style. Obviously, this is not going to go over well with the Sabine men. These women are their daughters and their wives, and so there is a war that follows between the Romans and the Sabines. The Sabines surround the Palatine Hill, and now the Romans have to figure out how they are going to deal with these Sabines. On the other hand, the Sabines have got to figure out a way to get into the Roman fortifications. What follows is one of the most interesting stories, in my view, in this period. It's the story of Tarpeia. So there is a woman named Tarpeia. She is the daughter of one of the Roman commanders. And she sneaks out of the Roman fortifications at night. She goes to the Sabine men. And she says, hey, look, guys, I can get you into the city. I can open up the gates. But you have to give me what is on your wrists. And at the time, what's on the wrists of these Sabine men, because they're not actively in battle, they're kind of waiting around and trying to figure out what's going to go on, are bracelets, like gold, silver bracelets. So she's basically saying, you need to pay me. And if you give me sufficient payment, when you come into the city, I'll open up the gates for you. So they say, all right, fine, we'll give you what is on our wrists when we come into the city. So Tarpeia betrays her own people, and she opens up the city gates, and the Sabines storm into the city. Then Tarpeia demands her payment. And her payment is not gold bracelets, because what the men have on their wrists when they take the city are these things right here on this coin. They may look like rocks to you, but if you look very closely, you can see the emblems. These are shields. And the coin shows the violent end of Tarpeia as the men give her what is on their wrists. That is, their shields. They pummel her with the shields and bury her. And Tarpeia will always be remembered, and her name will be attached to treason in the city of Rome. So anytime anyone commits a seriously grave crime against the Roman state, they are then cast off the Tarpeian rock, named after Tarpeia. It's a cliff that overlooks some pretty nasty, craggy rocks that, of course, once a person gets tossed off that cliff, they're going to fall to a very splattery death on those rocks. So that is the story of Tarpeia. Now, the Sabine women who are there in the city of Rome are excited, of course, to see their men greet them. On the other hand, they also want peace. And some of them have grown a little bit attached to those Roman men, like big, strong men carrying them out into the city of Rome. Maybe that's a marriageable guy. Either way, in the mythical story, the women basically broker a peace. They get the Sabine men, in many cases, to relinquish their claim over the women, and they get the Romans to also agree to a peace. And what happens is the two peoples are integrated. And Romulus, the king, at this point, he has a ruling council. He has a body of senators that's 100 men. He then brings in a another 100 men, these men from the Sabines. So you've got 100 Roman nobles and 100 Sabine nobles in a senate of 200 in total, and then a kingship between Romulus, and one of the Sabines is then allowed to be a kind of co-king with Romulus at this time. And the idea, of course, here is that Rome is ultimately justified in its expansion. It is good for Rome to pursue integration. So we have in this initial story the idea that, look, Rome is a kind of scrappy community. It brings people in, it civilizes them, right? That's one of the big things that happens in this story. It civilizes them, and it tends to create unity among peoples who are fighting. So that is largely the story of what happens under Romulus, or those are at least some of the two big stories. So after the death of Romulus, Rome's second king is going to be appointed. Now, this man's name is Numa, N-U-M-A. And Numa is initially very reluctant to become king. He's persuaded by the Senate because he is a wise and pious man, a God-fearing man, and so the Senate convinced him, hey, look, you're really the best person to become king. And Numa's reign will be one that is focused on religion and piety. Now, the fact that he refuses to become king, at least initially, is very important, because when these stories are told later on, especially under the Roman Empire, when Rome has emperors, this story is meant to govern the behavior of those emperors. It's meant to say, look, you shouldn't be too eager for power. Be like Numa. Be willing to take a beat before you do anything that involves seizing additional power. We see this even with Rome's first emperor, Augustus, who initially does not seize power. At least he conquers the Roman Empire in a civil war, and then he supposedly relinquishes his power, and the Senate say, well, look, you should just be the main person in charge of everything. And Augustus takes a line out of this story. He's like, no. I don't really want to be this, right? It's all a charade. But the point is, the story of Numa initially refusing to be king points to future Romans that they ought not to be too power hungry. And some Roman emperors take this quite literally and put on a little show of refusing power. Another emperor that did this, by the way, is Marcus Aurelius. All right. So, and Numa is a stark contrast to Romulus. So he is very peaceful. He's, like I said, very religious. There are a variety of reforms that he brings in. The most important of these have to do with religion. You see here the image of the two-faced god Janus. That's actually what you're looking at on your screen. Janus is a god of boundaries and doorways and transitions. The Temple of Janus is supposedly built by Numa, and the Temple of Janus signifies the status of Rome, whether it is in war or whether it transitions to peace. And so the gates of Janus are open or closed depending upon whether Rome is at war or under a state of peace vis-a-vis its various neighbors. And actually only very few times in Roman history is the city at peace. For example, the temples of Janus, the gates of the Temple of Janus are closed after the Second Punic War, when Rome decisively defeated Carthage. That was one of the very few times in Roman history when the doors of the Temple of Janus are closed. Another one, for example, would be after the Civil War that Augustus won. That's yet another parallel, by the way, between Augustus and Numa that he draws on purpose, right? He closes the gates of Janus after he wins the last Civil War in order to kind of harken back to the idea of the peace of Numa. Another really important religious institution that Numa puts into place is the College of the Vestal Virgins. The Vestal Virgins are women, young women typically from noble houses, that take a vow of chastity for 30 years. And this vow of chastity keeps them pure so that they can serve the goddess Vesta and tend to her sacred fire. Her sacred fire has to keep burning because that is that's sort of bound up with the prosperity, the fertility of the city of Rome. So you want women that are totally dedicated to keeping the sacred fire of Vesta. So that's a really important institution later on in the Roman Republic, and then a little bit into the Roman Empire as well. That starts with Numa. The last thing that I want to mention about Numa's reforms is something that actually we are all familiar with, whether we knew that Numa is supposedly responsible for it or not, and that is the calendar. The Romans had a 10-month calendar that began in the year of war, or excuse me, in the month of war. That is Mars, what we call March. March was the first month in the Roman calendar. And then you had, went through the various months. And that's why, for example, our ninth month is called September, because initially that was the seventh month, September, seventh month, right? If you go to a stop sign in the United States, it will be shaped like an octagon because it has 8 sides. But why is our 10th month called October? Our 10th month, if you translated the name of our 10th month, October, it literally means 8th month. Why is that? Why is our 10th month actually called the 8th month? Well, it's because Numa took the 10-day calendar, which ended with December, the 10th month, and he added 2 months to the beginning of the calendar. One of those, Janus, which we now call January, was named after this god that you got on your screen, Janus. So Numa reforms the calendar to give it a 10-month calendar, a 12-month calendar, which we still have to this day. These obviously are important religious institutions, whether it's the calendar or the temples or the Vestal Virgins. These are important religious institutions that emphasize piety. The Romans may be warlike, like Romulus, but they're also a pious people, and they recognize that with dutiful worship of the gods and organized and diligent religious practices, the keeping of days and dates and festivals, that the gods will bless them and give them peace. And that's exactly what Numa represents. Numa is an example of what happens when the Romans are religiously dutiful. All right, after Numa comes the king Tullus Hostilius. Tullus Hostilius is a completely different character when we compare him to Numa. Numa's pious and religious and peaceful. Tullus Hostilius, like his name implies, hostilis, where we get the term hostile, is a warlike, violent, almost like impetuous man. So he succeeds Numa in the 7th century or so, and his disposition also really changes the disposition of the Romans, and they find themselves in a series of conflicts. He has conflicts with the Sabines, who are already integrated into the city of Rome, so there's kind of a civil war going on. There's also a war with one of Rome's most important neighbors. That is Alba Longa, the place from which Romulus and Remus had at once descended from. So Alba Longa had been an ally of the Romans, but there had been some kind of tit-for-tat conflicts between some of the Romans and the Alba Longans, little like thieveries and robberies and things. Now, a more peaceful king could have resolved those conflicts, someone like Numa, but Tullus Hostilius is not that king, right? So these things, there's a war that erupts between the two peoples. The the king of Alba Longa ends up invading Roman territory. He dies. Then the Alba Longans, without a king, decide to appoint a dictator, which that's something, by the way, that the Romans will do later. The idea of a dictatorship becomes important for the Romans. And then after that, Tullus meets with the dictator. Those two engage in a confrontation. The Romans win that confrontation, and Tullus decides that he is not going to be merciful on Rome's former ally. He orders that his soldiers demolish the city of Alba Longa, a city that had supposedly existed for several hundred years. Only a few temples are left standing. The entire population that are left over are then moved to Rome. This effectively doubles the size of the Roman population. Some of the Roman families that exist later in the Republic all trace their lineage to Alba Longa. Famous families like the Julii, that would be the same family of Julius Caesar. The Servii, right? Very important Roman family. There would be others as well. The Senate is going to be too large now that the Roman population has doubled and more senators are named. So Tullus Hostilius builds a Senate house. And that Senate house during the Republic is still named the Curia Hostilia, presumably after this king. It would be weird otherwise to have the phrase Hostilia in the name of your Roman Senate building. He recruits heavily to build Rome's army, so he expands the number of soldiers, the number of legions, and obviously his policies are generally very aggressive. And this serves for more recent Romans, for Romans that live in the Republic and then in the Empire. This story serves to justify in many ways their ambitious and violent nature, which they do have. Now, ideally, that nature should not be left unchecked, and it should be governed by religious piety. How do we know this? Well, because of what happens to this king. Tullus Hostilius, according to the Roman author Livy, who writes about this mythical period, says that Tullus Hostilius became ill in a plague. Now, in that plague, he realizes that he is immortal. He realizes that he has neglected the gods, and so he decides to start worshiping the gods. Here's the problem, though. You can't just come to religion late. You can't be a thief on the cross in Roman religion. You had better know your religious rights, because that's what makes the gods well disposed towards you, not just simply believing in the gods or trusting in the gods, like, say, a Christian would later. You actually have to perform the rites exactly. That's what the gods care about. And of course, Tullus is uninitiated in the depths of Roman religion at this point, not like Numa. So he performs the ceremonies wrong. And the gods are unhappy with this. They reject him, and lightning strikes his house, and he's burned to death. So that's what happens to poor old Tullus. So a little lesson there for the Romans. All right, the last king that I want to talk about is on your screen. This is Ancus Marcius. He probably reigns, again, in the mythical calendar from the 640s BC to the late 600s, 616 or so BC. And again, he is kind of an interesting case as well, because he is known for several practical measures, okay? Ancus is the founder, for example, of the port of Ostia. Ostia is on the where the Tiber River meets the sea, and it's an important port for ships to offload that come from the sea, to offload their goods onto smaller boats that then move up the Tiber and can take those goods directly to Rome. I mean, who knows if this king even exists and really founded the port of Ostia, but that's the Romans' explanation for that port. Ancus was not a peaceful ruler, but he wasn't aggressive either. He tended to focus on defensive wars, making alliances, securing Rome's borders through a combination of necessary conflict but ideally diplomacy. And he is represented as a kind of balanced monarch. He's paid tribute in this coin that you see on your screen. You can actually see his name there, Ancus, right there on the coin. This is a silver denarius that's minted in Rome in the late Republic, 57 BC. His reign maintained the religious practices established by Numa, and then these practical measures, including foreign policy and infrastructure improvements, basically caused Rome to grow and become more secure. Now, after Ancus Marcius dies, we get the first Etruscan king, a man named Tarquinius Priscus, and he brings a great many Etruscan traditions into the city of Rome. Here is where mythology meets history. We don't know if Tarquinius Priscus was a real king. We do know, or we're almost certain, that Etruscan kings did at one point rule Rome. Who are the Etruscans? We'll talk about that in part 5. So catch the next video. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Thanks so much for checking out this video. I very much hope that you enjoyed it. And if you did, please like the video or leave a comment, or even better, subscribe to the channel. All of these things boost the channel tremendously in the YouTube algorithm. I also hope that you'll consider checking out my podcast, the Pax Romana Podcast. It uploads to YouTube, but it's also available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and just about anywhere else you can get podcasts. Finally, if you want to, you can follow me on X. Just look up at Prof CPE, at PROF CPE, and you can find me there. And of course, I'll continue to upload YouTube videos about once a week. Hope you enjoy. Thanks a bunch. We'll see you next time.